Liberalism versus Neoliberalism, a Global Shift in Economic Thought Introduction. Hello and welcome to Deconstruction Daily Podcast. In this episode, we're diving into two influential political and economic ideologies, liberalism and neoliberalism. These concepts shape much of the modern political landscape, yet they often get confused or used interchangeably. Therefore, we'll explore the key differences between liberalism and neoliberalism, trace their intellectual roots, and provide real-world examples of countries that have transitioned from liberal to neoliberal policies. 1. Defining liberalism, origins and intellectual foundations. Liberalism emerged in the 18th century as a response to the constraints of feudalism and absolute monarchies. Its core principles include individual freedom, democracy, and free markets, along with an emphasis on limited government intervention. Early liberal thinkers advocated for political and economic freedom, equality before the law, and the protection of private property. Key thinkers. John Locke, often called the father of liberalism, Locke argued for natural rights, life, liberty, and property, which should be protected by governments. His work laid the groundwork for both democracy and capitalism. Adam Smith, known for The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that free markets guided by an invisible hand would lead to wealth creation and social benefit, provided the government does not over-intervene. John Stuart Mill. Mill expanded on liberal thought with his ideas of individual liberty and utilitarianism, arguing that society should only limit freedom if it harms others. Liberalism in its classical form supports democracy, the rule of law, and the idea that governments should promote equality but allow people the freedom to pursue their own interests. Example of liberalism in practice: post-World War II European countries, like Britain and France, implemented liberal policies based on these ideas. After the war, there was an emphasis on rebuilding economies through social welfare programs, universal health care, and labor rights, aiming to balance free market capitalism with social justice. 2. What is neoliberalism? Emergence and key ideas. Neoliberalism developed in the 1970s as a response to the perceived failure of Keynesian economics, the idea that government intervention in the economy was necessary for stability and growth. While neoliberalism draws on some of the core principles of classical liberalism, it differs in its focus on deregulation, privatization, and a more extreme commitment to free markets. Key thinkers. Friedrich Hayek. Hayek's work was fundamental to the rise of neoliberalism. In his book The Road to Serfdom, he argued that government intervention in the economy inevitably leads to totalitarianism. For Hayek, individual freedom was inseparable from economic freedom and limited government. Milton Friedman, a leading figure in the neoliberal movement, Friedman's ideas, particularly on monetarism and the free market, reshaped economic policies around the world. His advocacy for minimal government intervention and his push for policies like privatization and deregulation became central to neoliberal reforms. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. While not academic intellectuals, Thatcher and Reagan were political figures who implemented neoliberal economic policies. They embraced ideas such as reducing the role of the state, curbing welfare programs, cutting taxes for the wealthy, and promoting free market globalization. Neoliberal ideas. Market fundamentalism. Neoliberalism advocates for minimal government in economic affairs and believes that markets, not states, should be the primary mechanism for allocating resources. Deregulation. Neoliberal policies emphasize the removal of government restrictions on business and industry, arguing that free markets work best without interference. Privatization. Public assets, like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, should be privatized and run like businesses. Globalization. Neoliberalism often supports global free trade agreements and open markets, reducing tariffs and barriers to international commerce. 3. Key differences between liberalism and neoliberalism. At first glance, liberalism and neoliberalism share a belief in free markets and limited government. However, neoliberalism takes these ideas much further, advocating for a complete withdrawal of the state from economic regulation and the privatization of public services. Here are a few key differences. Role of the state. Liberalism sees a limited role for the state, ensuring public welfare, providing public goods, and maintaining market regulation. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, pushes for almost no regulation, seeing the market as the only true force for economic growth. Social welfare. Classical liberalism supports a balance between individual freedom and social welfare, whereas neoliberalism often reduces welfare programs in favor of market-driven solutions. Globalization. While both ideologies support international trade, neoliberalism places much more emphasis on global integration and the global flow of capital, often at the expense of local economies and labor protections. 4. Neoliberalism in practice. Global examples. Neoliberalism has had a profound impact on economies worldwide, especially since the 1980s, with the rise of global capitalism. Countries that were once liberal have shifted toward neoliberal policies under the influence of institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. United Kingdom, from liberalism to neoliberalism. Before neoliberalism, in the post-World War II period, the UK was firmly in the realm of liberalism. The welfare state was expanded under the leadership of the Labour Party, with nationalised industries and a strong social safety net. Thatcher era. When Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, she implemented neoliberal policies, including privatizing state-owned industries, cutting taxes, and reducing welfare. Thatcher's policies marked a shift from the post-war welfare state towards a neoliberal agenda, emphasizing free markets and individual responsibility. United States, the Reagan Revolution. Before neoliberalism, after the New Deal era, the U.S. had a more liberal economic system, with government intervention in areas like labor rights, healthcare, and housing. Reagan era. Under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. embraced neoliberalism with massive tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation of industries, and privatization of public services. Reagan's policies paved the way for the rise of global capitalism and the spread of neoliberalism across the globe. Latin America, the Washington Consensus. In the 1980s and 1990s, Latin American countries that had previously relied on state-led economic models were pressured by international institutions like the IMF to adopt neoliberal reforms. This process was called the Washington Consensus. Examples: countries like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil implemented neoliberal policies like privatization, trade liberalization, and austerity measures. Chile, under Augusto Pinochet, became a neoliberal laboratory, where privatization and deregulation were implemented extensively. Global South and neoliberalism. Many countries in the Global South, particularly in Africa and Asia, were pushed into adopting neoliberal policies by international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, often as a condition for receiving loans or debt relief. These countries saw the privatization of state-owned industries, cutbacks in social programs, and the implementation of free market reforms, policies that disproportionately benefited multinational corporations and wealthy elites, often at the expense of the majority of citizens. 5. Criticisms of neoliberalism. While neoliberalism has reshaped the global economy, it has also faced significant criticism. Rising inequality. Neoliberalism has been accused of exacerbating economic inequality as wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of the richest individuals and corporations. Erosion of public services. Privatization and deregulation have led to the weakening of public services like healthcare, education, and transportation, often resulting in reduced access for marginalized populations. Environmental degradation. Neoliberal policies have been linked to environmental harm, as deregulation often leads to exploitation of natural resources without concern for sustainability or long-term environmental impact. Conclusion. In conclusion, while both liberalism and neoliberalism advocate for market economies and individual freedom, neoliberalism represents a more extreme form of market-driven capitalism that prioritizes deregulation, privatization, and global trade at the expense of social welfare and equality. I hope you have enjoyed the podcast. If so, Please like and subscribe to the channel for more informative episodes. Thanks for patiently watching the podcast, and I look forward to catching up with you with another episode. Please leave me comments and share your thoughts and feedback with me.